On this episode of Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans, join me as I take a dive into the case of Daniel Morcombe, the 13-year-old boy who went to buy Christmas presents for his family and never came home. Coming up right after this. Hi everyone, welcome to Crime Scenes with Coffee Beans. I am your host, Belinda Brady, and welcome to my little podcast, guys. Now, straight off the bat, I want to say thank you for listening. Thank you for downloading me, and please leave me some feedback. You can buy me a coffee, send me a text, send me a message via YouTube, send me a message on TikTok. Don't be shy, guys. I don't bite, please. I'd love to hear from all of you. And let's have a look at the stats real quick. Let's have a look at where you guys are all listening from. So I normally do the top three. So Australia is leading the charge, coming in at first, then New Zealand at number 2, and then the United States coming in at number 3. And coming up at number 4 is Singapore. So awesome work, guys. Love it. Let's see those stats keep going. Let's keep it going, guys. And of course, if you want to subscribe and hear some ghost stories, that will go perfectly with my crime stories, because crime and ghosts go hand in hand. Please, you can subscribe. I think it's as little as $3 a month. You can subscribe and you will get bonus episodes of ghost stories. Go on. You know you want to. Okay, and what am I drinking? For people who have been listening to me for a while, you know I talk about these crimes while I'm drinking a coffee. And today I'm sticking with my tried and true black coffee with syrup, and the syrup is mocha. I really, really like it. Decent coffee syrup in Australia is hard to come by. So when I do find it, I tend to buy a lot of it. And whatever you guys are doing, however you're listening to me, whether you're at home, at the gym, driving, getting ready for bed, I do hope you have caffeine. If whatever you're doing allows it, or if not, I hope you've got time to listen and settle in and listen. And again, thank you so much for your company. Now, straight off the bat, this episode does talk about child murder and sexual assault. So if that is a trigger for you, please, listener discretion is advised. And my sources for this episode is courts.queensland.gov.au, abc.net.au, brisbanetimes.com.au. So this episode is about 13-year-old Daniel Morcombe, the young boy who went to buy Christmas presents for his family one Sunday afternoon and he never came home. It was a devastating case, and I think all of us in Australia were very well aware of Daniel's case and his family trying to find their boy, and it's just beyond heartbreaking. So again, I'll give you a little trigger warning. This episode is quite distressing, but Daniel's story needs to be told. So let's get into it. Okay, Christmas is a time of joy, isn't it? No matter what you do, if you're over the top with everything from decorating to the food, or if you're a bit of a Grinch and you like to keep it low key, Christmas will warm the coldest of hearts. I don't care what anybody says. And as for 13-year-old Daniel Morcombe, he was just like the rest of us, and he wanted to get a bit of a head start on his Christmas shopping. He'd been paid. He had a small job with his brother. They'd pick passion fruit for a neighbour, and he got paid and thought, I'm going to go to the shops, to the local plaza, and buy my family a Christmas present. Buy my family their Christmas presents. And so that's what he did. One Sunday afternoon in December, he set out to buy his family Christmas presents and get himself a haircut. And he made this trip many times before and he'd never had a problem. So, no one thought anything of him doing it again. Only this time he never made it to the shopping centre and he never came home. And what happened after Daniel went missing brought his beautiful, beautiful family unimaginable grief, brought his friends and community and the country unimaginable grief, and it would be years before we finally found out what happened to Daniel and before he was found. So before we get to that, let's get back to the beginning and let's settle in. So grab your drink, get yourself settled, my true crime family, and maybe get yourself some tissues because this is a tough one, but we're going to hear it. So here we go. Now, Daniel Morcombe was a twin. He was born to parents Denise and Bruce on the 19th of December 1989, along with his unidentical twin brother Bradley in Melbourne, Victoria. And he also had another brother, Dean. So there were three boys, Daniel, Bradley, and Dean. And in 2003, the family relocated to the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. Now, the Sunshine Coast is a beautiful part of Queensland. Think beaches, think lush bush, think just this really cool coast yet hinterland vibe. It is a beautiful part of the country. It truly is. And they've relocated to the Sunshine Coast where Daniel's parents, Bruce and Denise, had a franchise. And all three boys went to Siena Catholic College in Sippy Downs. And Daniel loved motocross and he absolutely adored caring for his pets. Now, like I said a little bit earlier, Daniel and his brothers picked passion fruit for a neighbour. So on a neighbouring property had passion fruit that needed to be picked. So Daniel and his brothers did this part-time for a little bit of pocket money, and Daniel was a happy kid. He was a happy kid, happy typical 13-year-old boy, loved his parents, loved his grandparents, his brothers, and all knew him, and they all loved him back. Now, on the day of the 7th of December 2003, Daniel and his brothers had picked passion fruit for their neighbours, and Daniel had been paid $90 for his efforts that week. So that was his week's pay. Now, the boys were home by about 9:45 a.m. and his parents were about to head off for a Christmas party. Now, his parents were franchisees for Jim's Trees, which is a branch of Jim's Mowing, which is a massively successful business here in Australia. It's people who come out and mow your lawn or do your garden, etc. And Jim's Trees was a tree pruning and removal franchise. Now, Bruce and Denise had organised a Christmas party in a park with other franchisees that day, and it was about an hour or so away. So they needed to, get in the car and get on with it, make their way there. Now, the start time for this party was around 2:00. Now, the boys were going to go with their parents to the party, but as they had been late getting to their passion fruit picking because there was a storm earlier and they needed to wait for things to clear up, they were late getting home and they didn't want to go. Bruce and Denise were happy for their boys to stay home. They were responsible and trustworthy, and the neighbours knew them, and if anything happened, they could go to their neighbours. So they bid their boys farewell and hopped in the car and went to their party. Now, Daniel left home at around 1 p.m, having decided to go to the local shopping centre, which is Sunshine Plaza. And he left armed with his pay to buy Christmas presents for his family and to get himself a haircut. And he was wearing a pair of navy blue shorts and a red Billabong t-shirt. He walked the 1.3 kilometres to Nambour Connection Road, where he waited for a bus under the Keel Mountain Road underpass. Though this wasn't an official bus stop, Daniel and his brothers had caught buses from there before, so it wouldn't be unusual for Daniel to think he could do that again. So that's what he told his brothers he was doing. He was going to the underpass to catch the bus. Now, when Denise and Bruce got home later that afternoon, there was still no sign of Daniel, so Denise hopped in her car and drove to the bus stop to pick Daniel up at about 4:30 p.m, but he wasn't there. So she thought he might have just stayed back at the shopping centre later So she went back there at about 5:30, but he still wasn't there. Now, at this point, both Denise and Bruce drove to Sunshine Plaza where Daniel was supposedly shopping and looked for him, but they had no luck. They followed the bus route on the way home, hoping they might see him walking home, but again, they had no luck. Now, they managed to flag down a bus to see if there was anyone back at the bus depot to ask whether the buses had been on time that day and if there were any sightings of Daniel, but they were told there was no one at the bus depot because it was a Sunday afternoon. They then went back to Sunshine Plaza again to look for Daniel, and at around 7:30 p.m. they went to the Maroochydore police station to report their son missing. There they spoke to a sergeant by the name of Sergeant Munn. They told Sergeant Munn that this was totally out of character for Daniel and he always called if he was going to be late. Sergeant Munn told the Morcombes that it was probably a misunderstanding and he wouldn't report Daniel missing as yet. He told them to go home and wait, and he was sure Daniel was running late with his friends and he would turn up, he'd turn up sooner or later. The Morcombes returned home and contacted Daniel's friends who all said they hadn't seen him. They went to their neighbours' houses to see if they had seen him, and no one had seen him since he left that house earlier that afternoon. Now, during this time, they received 3 phone calls from police asking if Daniel had returned. And when they told the police no, they were told to return to the station the following morning at 8 o'clock to report him missing, because apparently the police didn't have the resources to go to the Morcombes to start, making that report. Bruce later said that he felt like their concerns about Daniel and his disappearance were not being taken seriously. At dawn the next day, the 8th of December, after what would have been a hellish night of wondering where Daniel was, the Morcombes started looking for Daniel. They went back to the overpass where he would have waited for the bus. They went back to Sunshine Plaza and they again walked the route that Daniel would have walked. They went to the Palm Woods police station at 8 o'clock where they were met by Sergeant Davison, who took the details of what Daniel was wearing and what he would have been doing. The sergeant called the bus company that ran the route that Daniel would have taken, and the bus company was called Sunbus, and it was confirmed that a boy matching Daniel's appearance was seen at the underpass and that he was in the company of an older male. And for some reason, for God knows what reason, the sergeant did not pass this on to the Morcombes. Now, at this point, Detective Senior Sergeant Schmidt took over the case. He took it over that same day, and police divers were sent to search nearby rivers. SES, which is State Emergency Services, which is volunteers that help when people go missing or people need to be found, searched the local area. Door knocks were carried out and forensic examinations were conducted at the overpass where Daniel was waiting for the bus, and every Sun bus linked to that route was given the forensic examination. They looked at CCTV from Sunshine Plaza, and known sex offenders around the area were interviewed, as was the nearby Christian Outreach Centre and the local taxi company. No stone was left unturned. At this point, Daniel was all over the media. I remember seeing his face on my TV when he was first reported as missing. The police and Daniel's parents were pleading with anyone who knew where he was or any information to, please come forward. Nothing was left unturned. Daniel's face was everywhere. People were looking for him everywhere, but the days turned into weeks and the weeks turned into years, and there was no sign of Daniel. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. The Morcombes were in a living hell, but they never, ever gave up on their boy. In 2004, a $250,000 reward was offered for any information on Daniel. With this reward, with people actively looking for Daniel, asking for information, and there's still no information on what happened to Daniel. And in 2008, the reward is up to $1 million. In October 2010, a coronial inquest is held and is adjourned in April 2011. And only 6 months later, a breakthrough. The breakthrough the Morcombes and Australia had been waiting 8 years for. Daniel had finally been found, and an arrest had finally been made. But before we get to that, we need to go back to when Daniel first went missing, and most importantly, the bus stop where Daniel had been waiting. Now, police interviewed everyone from passers-by to passengers on any bus that went past that bus stop that day, and many, if not all, said the same thing, that they had seen a boy looking like Daniel at the bus stop, and they had seen a man standing not too far away from him. Now, this man was supposedly behind a blue car that had been parked just off to the side. The man was described as scruffy with a ponytail. He was thin and was aged between 35 and 45. Now, it's also worth mentioning here that people also said they saw a white four-wheel drive parked near the bus stop. So we have a scruffy looking man and two different cars. And unbeknownst to these witnesses, police had been given a list of every known sex offender in the area. And in the days after Daniel first went missing, they personally went and interviewed every single one of them. On that list was the name Brett Cowan. Brett Cowan, who was 41 years old at the time, had a string of charges against him. He was a real piece of work, with child sex offences being the most serious charges. Yeah, Brett was 18 at the time, and he was doing community service thanks to a drug offence. He was doing this community service in a public park in Brisbane, Queensland, where he saw a 7-year-old boy and took him from the park, dragged him to the toilet and raped him. He was sentenced to only 2 years jail, but served only 1. In 1993, while living in Darwin in the Northern Territory, Brett struck again, this time raping a 6-year-old boy and leaving him for dead. Now, this poor boy managed to get himself to a petrol station and ask for help. And police initially thought he had been hit by a car. His injuries were that extreme. That's how bad Brett hurt this poor little boy. When questioned, Brett pled his innocence, even going as far to say, "I hope you catch the bastard," when the police questioned him. And Brett refused to give up a DNA sample after semen was found on the young boy's underwear. And a background check quickly told police that Brett was their guy. Brett confessed eventually when confronted with the evidence, and he was charged and sentenced to 7 years in jail, but only served 3.5 years. Why he was released when this was his second offence against a child is mind-boggling. Anyway, Brett moved to Queensland, became a reformed Christian, and married another churchgoer, a woman by the name of Tracy, and the two had 2 children together. A few days after Daniel went missing, police paid him a visit, and they noticed in his driveway he had a white 4-wheel drive with a black snorkel, which was one of the cars that was apparently seen at the bus stop where Daniel went missing from. Now, one of the detectives was struck by the odd things Brett had in his yard. Brett made things to sell at local markets, and the police noticed that the things like the little windmills that he made were made in a way to appeal to kids, Like they had little butterflies and stuff painted on them. And one even commented that Brett's front yard was strange and it looked like a kids' area, even though Brett wasn't living with his wife and kids at the time. And both detectives did not like him the minute they met him, and they knew there was something about him. Brett admitted to being in the area and specifically driving past the bus stop where Daniel was waiting, but he insisted he was only driving past it because he was on his way to pick up a mulcher. Brett denied having seen Daniel on his travels, and despite his car having, or a car similar to his car having been seen at the scene, still denied being anywhere near it. But when a detective said, "You're a pedophile, a bad one by the looks of it, and Daniel is in your preferred age group," Brett replied with, "Well, he looked it." The detective jumped on this, replying, "Did he? That's strange. I thought you said he didn't see anyone." And Brett said to that, "Oh, well, I might have pulled over." Now, the police, their senses, their spidey senses were tingling. They knew something was off about Brett. They knew he had form. He was a sex offender. He, even that little conversation with them, they were like, nah, something is sus about this guy. But due to lack of actual evidence, they left with nothing but that gut feeling. But they knew the cocky, creepy man that they had just interviewed was the man they were looking for, but they had nothing. They had nothing to hold him on. Now, Brett also told the police that at one point he went to buy drugs off his drug dealer. He was a pot smoker. He smoked marijuana. And this was denied by his occasional drug dealer. She said, "No, I never saw Brett that afternoon." And, she said, "We were down the RSL, we were playing the pokies, we were having an afternoon together." Her partner backed up that story. So twice Brett's now being called out. He said he was getting a mulcher, not true. He said he went to buy a pot, not true. He said he may or may not have stopped at the bus stop because Daniel looked the type. Now, police had to go to extraordinary lengths to catch Brett out. And how they did this was a police operation, a big sting. Now, this isn't normally done in Australia. It has been used in Canada. And the one in Canada was a case called Mr. Big. And that's how they trapped and caught, I guess, people suspected of being, drug lords or big crime rings. And so we've never done anything like this really here in Australia, but to get Brett, this is what the police had to do. So they went undercover. The sting consisted of undercover cops posing as criminal gangs, trying to recruit other criminals for fictional crimes. So if the police wanted to get you, but they had no physical evidence, they couldn't pin anything on you, but they knew you were their guy, they could go undercover, create this fictional world, this fictional gang, and try and recruit you to join. And that's what they did with Brett. And sooner or later, as you gain the trust of this criminal fictional gang, they will then ask you to, hey, what's your biggest crime? What's the worst crime you've committed? Because if we want to go further with you in our little gang, we need to know if there's anything we need to cover up. And that's how they get you. And that's how they got Brett. And how they got him is nothing short of remarkable. Now, Brett had moved to Perth in Western Australia. And the sting began when an undercover police officer, one who called him Joe, sat next to Brett on a flight to Perth. and the two hit it off. They had a chat, they exchanged numbers, and over the next couple of weeks, this undercover copper was texting Brett about, these jobs that were coming up, and do you want to help me out, mate? And there's a bit of money in it for you. Now, one of the first jobs Brett was recruited to do was to help stake out a man at Perth Airport for this fictional crime gang, and he was paid $150 for his efforts. Now, over the following months, Brett was involved in 23 more fictional crimes, which included bribing customs officers into trafficking weapons, crayfish, and even blood diamonds from Africa into the country. So Brett thought he was part of this massive international gang, this crime gang doing all sorts of crimes, when in reality he was just being suckered more and more into eventually confessing. Brett was none the wiser. He was wrapped in his newfound job and his friend group, telling Joe, the undercover copper, I found the job I've been waiting for all these years. But by 2011, there was one problem. The fictional crime gang had a big boss. This big boss's name was apparently Fitzy. And Fitzy had gotten wind that Brett was going to be subpoenaed for yet another probe into Daniel Morcombe's disappearance. Fitzy couldn't have this. If he was going to have Brett in his criminal gang, he needed to know if there was anything that he needed to cover up. So they called Brett into a meeting, and they all met in a plush Perth hotel. These are all undercover cops, remember. They met in a plush Perth hotel, and Fitzy didn't hesitate in telling Brett he'd be dropped like a hot potato if he didn't confess to anything that they needed to cover up. They also insisted they needed to know if Brett did have anything to do with Daniel Morcombe's disappearance, and if he did, they needed to know what happened and where Daniel was so they could fix up any evidence he might have left behind. Brett spilled his guts. He told his gang members that he thought Daniel was a fucking cute little thing when he saw him waiting for the bus that December afternoon and stopped, pulled over, and lured Daniel into his car. He took Daniel to an abandoned demountable at a sand mining site in the Glass Mountains, which is not far from the Sunshine Coast. And the Glass Mountains is quite isolated, where he had, quote, man fun 4 times before. Now, when Brett got Daniel into the demountable, he took his pants off and went to assault Daniel, but Daniel panicked and tried to escape, but Brett pulled him back and got him in a headlock and choked him. Then when he was dead, he put Daniel's body in the back of his car and drove him to the banks of a river where he buried him. So the river was on the property. That's where he buried him. He then threw Daniel's clothes and shoes into a nearby creek, and he went on with his day. Brett then returned to the property about a week later to dispose of any evidence, and he found a bit of Daniel's skull, which he broke up with his shovel. He went back, got his shovel, and broke it up. So with this information at hand, Brett and his undercover cop / fictional crime gang friends jumped on a plane, went back to Queensland to the site where Brett had buried Daniel on the ruse that they were going to destroy any remaining evidence that might still be there. But police were waiting, and once they arrived, police jumped out of the bushes and arrested Brett. Now, this operation, this sting, had been months in the making, and included so many undercover police officers and people in on it, and people having to just trust the process. And it would have been so frustrating at times for these undercover officers to listen to what Brett had confessed to and still have to try and act like you're his mate. but it paid off and they had their man. Police had their man, but they still didn't have Daniel. And after days of searching for him, for his body, for any remains, they were worried that maybe Brett was just making this whole thing up to impress his gangster, fictional gangster buddies. But then on day 4 of searching, they found a shoe. They then found another one a day later. Now, the shoes were a skate brand called Globe Brand, and the police traced them back to the same shop that Daniel had bought the exact same pair from. Now, a podiatrist performed a biometric analysis of these shoes and other shoes that Daniel had worn because they were still at home, and they showed matching wear patterns, meaning that the shoes that had been found were Daniel's. It would be a grueling 4 weeks before Daniel was found, and even then, it was only 17 bone fragments. Time and elements had taken most of him, but at the very least, his family had some part of him back. Finally, after 8, nearly 9 long years, they finally had something. In December 2012, 9 years to the day after Daniel went to the shops and never came home, his family bid him farewell. Hundreds attended his funeral, and his parents asked the mourners not to be sad, but to celebrate Daniel's life, with his father Bruce saying, "Today is about embracing his return to family and being reflective of what might have been." Brett Cowan stood trial for Daniel's murder in February 2013 in Queensland's Supreme Court, which is located in Brisbane, Queensland. And straight off the bat, Brett tried to say he only confessed to Daniel's murder because of the money the fictional crime gang was offering him. He pled not guilty, but declined to give any evidence. The evidence against Brett was his confession, his disgusting past as a known sex offender, and his car that had been seen at the bus stop. Daniel's family gave impact statements, with Daniel's father telling of how his son's last moments have haunted him and his family, how they had to sell their home, their business because they couldn't function, how their friends from when Daniel went missing are different now because they are no longer the same people. Their grief and their trauma has made them short-tempered and bitter, and it's all thanks to Brett Cowan's decision to kidnap Daniel that day for no reason other than his own sick pleasure. He also told Brett that sitting in the same room as him revolts him and that he has no chance of rehabilitation. The court determined that Daniel was dead within an hour of going missing, and the question of Brett's confession being fake was easily dismissible. Brett knew exactly where Daniel was. He knew the location where Daniel was going to be found. He knew that his shoes and clothing had also been tossed away. If he wasn't there, if he didn't do it, how did he know it? The evidence against him was just too compelling. And in March 2014, a jury of 6 men and 6 women found Brett Cowan guilty of the murder of Daniel Morcombe, as well as indecently dealing with a child under 16 and improperly dealing with a corpse, because the week after Daniel died, Brett went back to destroy remains of him so he wouldn't be found. The verdict was met with cheers and tears, and outside the court, the Morcombes thanked the police for their support and the public for their support, and at last justice had been served. Brett Cowan, who never once showed any remorse for his actions, was sentenced to life in prison with the chance of parole after 20 years, but the sentencing judge residing over the case, a judge by the name of Judge Rosalind Atkinson, said, "I am not of the view that you should be released in 20 years' time, but that is not in my control." As it stands, Brett Cowan will spend the rest of his life in jail. There has been several attempts on his life. He has been attacked several times. He has been stabbed. He has had boiling water thrown over him, and prison authorities have foiled a plan to kill him. So at the very least, his days will be forever looking over his shoulder. The Morcombes have turned their tragedy into power, and in the years after they lost Daniel, they formed the Daniel Morcombe Foundation, where they educate children, adults and schools about stranger danger and child safety, and they go all around the country spreading the word of Daniel's story and helping children to stay safe. Only last week, a law called Daniel's Law was passed in Queensland's state parliament, where child sex offenders will be on a public register for anyone in the public to access and view. Long overdue, and in my opinion, we need this countrywide, not just statewide. I and many Australians are in awe of this family and their strength and resilience, and I take my hat off to them. They really are angels. I'm in awe of this family. And if you are interested in learning more about Daniel's Law and the Daniel Morcombe Foundation and how it can help you and a child in your life, then please check out their site on www.danielmorcombe, and that is spelled DanielMorcombe.com.au. My heart goes out to the Morcombes and all who knew and loved Daniel. May his memory be a blessing. And there we have it, guys. The heartbreaking story of the 13-year-old boy who went out to buy his family Christmas presents, and it just happened to be the time when a sex predator who should never have been walking among us just happened to be driving past. It's just so heartbreaking, and it's so horribly, horribly unfair. So there we have it, guys. Thank you so much for listening. And if you are liking these episodes, if you are enjoying them, please like and share. Share me with everybody you know. Share me with people you don't know. Get the word out there. And, if you have any coffee that you want me to try, that you want me to drink while I'm talking to you guys, let me know. I'm always up for new caffeine treats. I'll try anything once. And of course, thank you again for listening. You're all amazing, absolute rock stars. And until next time, stay safe, stay cool, and stay caffeinated. I will catch you all later.